Welcome this afternoon. The second of our public events, and one that we started some years ago called Meet the Legends. It's all part of my frame of reference that the history of what we lived through post-World War II is moving forward. And it's important that we keep track of all this. So you can find on our website the previous Meet the Legends. We posted the entire videos, and today this is being videotaped as well for history. What has been put together by Michael Lynch and Tom Strongman is a fundamental structure along with the key people who we identified in the whole total performance powered by Ford era of 50 years ago. And so we have Peter Brock, Bob Bondurant, Steve Volk, Alan Grant, the four key players that we brought in. What? Oh, Pat Bondurant, excuse me, Pat. Pat and I had dinner last night together, and I really enjoyed it. And I've been all day, as we've been talking both last night and today, I've been putting into my computer different things that I have to send her, because there's lots of things about keep in quiet places to park at Pebble Beach, the Villa d'Est Concours at Lake Como next May, so lots of different things. We're going to be communicating a great deal. The point is, we're here to hear these legends and to understand the story. And the basic story has been curated by Michael Lynch, who moved back to Kansas City from San Francisco, grew up in this community, spent most of his years on the West Coast involved with the Pebble Beach Concours and the Quail and Concorso Italiano and many others. He's back and living in Kansas City, and I like to say has forgotten more about the vintage cars than I know. So Michael has curated this afternoon along with Tom Strongman, former auto editor, retired editor of the Kansas City Star, and the two have put together a wonderful package. So Michael?
Okay, I'm going to introduce our guests in a moment, but first I want to start out with a history of Ford's Total Performance Program. This took place started in the early 60s and continued throughout most of the decade, and some of its effects went on for another 20 years. Probably the most lavishly financed group of endeavors in motor racing in the history of the sport. So we'll start out, and Tom, can you get us going here? In 1955, there was a very terrible crash at Le Mans. A race car went into the crowd, killing over 80 people, and it led the American automobile manufacturers to ban American manufacturers from taking part in racing. They wanted them to stress the safety aspect. McNamara was the head of Ford at the time, and he was pushing dish steering wheels and safety belts and things like that. However, he was appointed Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and Lee Iacocca came in. Iacocca had a different idea. He realized that the baby boomers were coming of car buying age and that Ford's stodgy line probably wasn't doing a hell of a lot for them. So in 1962 in June, Henry announced that Ford was dropping out of the manufacturer's agreement about racing. And that set off the Total Performance Program, which was handled by the promotional rather than racing people at the beginning. It was a concept, and they figured they would add initiatives as they went along. Carroll Shelby, sitting in the very back here, they were already making Cobras, so he kind of lucked into the first amount of support because he already had cars that could win races. The Cobra program morphed into something much bigger to take on the world's manufacturing championship in Europe. And the key tool for that was the Cobra Daytona Coupe, which was designed by this gentleman right here, one of the great iconic shapes in all of motor racing history. They also went into the Indianapolis 500. It was a program that took 3 years. They started with a stock block engine, but then in '64 they had a 4-cam purpose-built racing motor. And this is '65, that's Jimmy Clark, who won the Indy 500, the first rear-engine car ever to win one with a Ford engine. This is Le Mans, which was probably their biggest target, and they won it after 3 years of trying in 1966. This is the 1967 winner, driven by Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt. First time and only time, I think, an American car with an all-American crew has won there. This is an interesting picture. If you'll notice the oil dry on the outside of the course, which is a residual of a earlier leaking car, and the bump on the driver's side, which is the right side of the car, that's so you could accommodate Dan Gurney's height. So it was a successful program, but they were not limited to these 3 programs, although they were their major ones. By the way, just last weekend, the 50th anniversary of the Ford GT win, they repeated. This time it was a class win rather than an overall win, but nonetheless, quite an impressive showing after only having run a very few races. They also won in stock car racing. This is Mario Andretti after winning the, where are we, '67 Daytona 500. This was the first time that an Indy driver had beaten all the NASCAR regulars. Also, they took part in Grand Prix racing. By 1968, this is Graham Hill, who won the World Championship that year. The engine was from a company called Cosworth, but they badged it as a Ford Cosworth. And those engines, actually between 1968 and '82, they won 10 manufacturers and 12 drivers' championships. They also won in drag racing and many other forms of lower level racing. And so to say it was successful was quite an understatement. Okay, we are going to introduce our guests. On my left, the first person is Peter Brock, one of the great designers he started at GM as one of the youngest people there, worked on the iconic '63 Stingray, decided he wanted to go racing, so went to California and was a racer like the rest of these dudes. And then he got into, after working for Shelby, had his own race team. This team here came to Kansas City in July 1971. There was a race out on the old Olathe Naval Air Base, and his team won their race, and in fact that year won the championship in the Trans Am Series. These are some of the cars. This car, by the way, is a De Tomaso P70, designed by Peter. He went over to work in Italy on it, which did not thrill De Tomaso. The car was stillborn. The program was canceled in the middle. Luckily, the car has survived and been restored. This car will be on the field tomorrow, thanks to Mark Marchade, and we cannot thank him enough for bringing it. This is a Hino, a Japanese make you're not familiar with. And this is another wonderful Brock design of the era. Okay, this is the introduction of Alan Grant, who is on the far side of the table. Alan Grant ironically started racing an AC Ace, which is what this car is. Ironic, I say, because this is what ultimately became the basis for the Cobra. Alan went to work for Shelby as a mechanics helper. Shelby had and something we will discuss later, I think, Shelby had a habit of saying, well, you know, if you come in, work on the line, help me, I'll get you into one of the race cars. Well, he didn't get him into one of the race cars, so Alan went out and got his own. And this is the first race he ran. It was at Santa Barbara in 1963, and he won. He also drove this car, a Cheetah. Many of you have not heard of it. It was a brutal, very well designed but never properly developed car by a guy named Bill Thomas out in California. Alan drove that all through 1964. And then we go on to Bob Bondurant, who is sitting next to his wife, Pat. Bob came up, he started in Morgan's. He came up and made his first big impression in Corvettes and was the man in California Corvette racing, which I can tell you was quite competitive. From there, he moved to Shelby, to the Cobra team. When they won the championship in 1965, it was at Rem, France. And this is him on that day. And it just happened to be July 4th, which made it fairly sweet for an American driver and an American team. We'll tell you another story later about that day or that weekend. Here's Bob in a Formula One Ferrari, a BRM Ferrari at Monte Carlo, a All-American Racers Eagle Formula One car in Mexico. You can see his career was quite extensive. And here he is in a Can-Am McLaren, which also ran in some USRRC, United States Road Racing Championship events. Okay, and next is Steve Volk. And Steve is a collector, historian, whatever you want to call him. It's hard to say, a man about automobiles. He realized quite early the importance of the Shelby Endeavors, the Ford Endeavors, and he has built a collection of the finest Shelby cars and memorabilia in the world in his museum, the Shelby American Collection in Boulder, Colorado. If you're ever there, believe me, you should check it out. It's pretty fantastic. And he has brought some fantastic cars today, which he will talk about and which will be on the field tomorrow. Steve?
Thanks, Michael. My name is Steve Volk. I'm the president, one of the founders of the Shelby American Collection in Boulder, Colorado. I got to tell you, the first question we get frequently when people walk in, and if you go back one slide, no, other direction. There you go. The first reaction we get when people walk into the museum is, oh my God, why Boulder, Colorado? This is unbelievable. And it's very simple answers because we live there. And we set this up in 1996, and it's a great place to live. I used to live in Kansas City, so I love Kansas City too. We set it up in 1996 as a nonprofit organization, and we just had a handful of cars back then, and it's just grown over the years. And there's a lot of different folks that have cars, like the Larry H. Miller family, or Tom and Karen Benjamin, that keep their cars at the Shelby American Collection. It's a nonprofit. It's a 501c3, and the reason is that a lot of the memorabilia and photo archives that we have they're very extensive, and a lot of these materials have been donated. So we view ourselves as a repository of this information, and when items are donated to the museum, whether it's an AC Bristol, or we just recently got the 1966 Shelby Mustang GT 350S. There's only one. It's the supercharged prototype. When those items are donated to us, they're really in the public domain, and it's our responsibility to be open to the public and to periodically take these cars around so that the public can see them. Next slide, please. So our hero, of course, is Carroll Shelby, and I met him back in the 80s when I was vintage racing. He came up to me, a Cobra, of course. I started with a Ferrari and didn't get very far, so I switched to a Cobra and started doing a lot better. But I met Carroll Shelby at Road Atlanta. He came up to me in the 80s when I was racing a factory team car. When we became friends over the years, and I started accumulating more and more memorabilia, to one day, the wife said, this is way out of hand. And so we got a building and moved everything in, and it's just picked up momentum from there. And we've been very fortunate because folks like Alan Grant and Bob Bondurant and Bob and Pat Bondurant and Pete Brock and all the guys have been very generous with their time coming to our events. Over the years, we've had relationships, obviously, with Phil Hill and Phil Remington, Bob Johnson, Tom Payne, Carroll Shelby, Ray Geddes, all the guys, many of which unfortunately have passed. But my message here is very simple, I'll take the next slide, please. I want to talk very briefly about what Carroll Shelby did and the Shelby American team, and of which we have 3 members. We're very fortunate to be in the presence of 3 members today of the Shelby American team. Aside from racing the Cobra, and winning in USRRC, these guys, United States Road Racing, these guys also won the FIA championship. And there's more. Next slide. They took the Mustang, and everybody has a different view of what the Mustang was like in 1964, but these guys took a 1965 fastback and turned it into just a hell of a SCCA racer, to the point that they won the SCCA championship in 65 and 66 and 67. Here's the USRRC. This is one of the, with Ken Miles, the 98 car, also in our museum. Ken did a tremendous amount for the Shelby American team, as many of you know. They won the USRRC championship in 1964 under the leadership, with Ken Miles kind of taking the lead on that. Next. And of course, there's FIA, the World Manufacturers Championship. And here's a shot of Bob in the FIA Cobra Roadster that we've brought this weekend for you to see. And Bob's at the Nürburgring in this shot, just doing a little practice warming up. Next slide. And then I've got a few shots here that probably many of you have never seen, and you're probably wondering, oh, who is this handsome young man? It's this guy right here. These are kind of rare color shots from Le Mans in 65. This is Sebring. Next shot. There we go.
Monza.
This is at Monza.
Yeah.
And there's 2 handsome men in this shot. On one that's on my right and one on the left. Next slide, please. So they won the World Manufacturers Championship with the Cobra, the Daytona Coupes, and the Cobra Roadster. They won the USRRC 1964 championship with the Cobras, the Roadsters. They won in SCCA with the Mustang for many years. And then, of course, Shelby had a major role with the GT40 program. And these guys were responsible for the winning Le Mans in 1966, and all with the Mark II GT40, and with the Mark IV in 1967. Now, Marshall had originally asked he asked me to bring the 66 Le Mans winner, and that was our initial plan. Then got a phone call from Ford saying we need the 66 Le Mans winner to go back to Le Mans to do some exhibition. So instead, we brought a 1968 Gulf Mirage Mark I. That's a very famous car, one of 3, that I think you'll enjoy seeing. Not part of so much the Shelby history, but definitely a very significant Ford-powered vehicle. So that's our mission at the museum, is to maintain, to preserve the history, and to convey it every chance I get.
Thank you very much. Are you ready? Okay. Now we are going to go into the best part of the program, the stories of the 3-year battle beginning in 1963 for the World Manufacturers Championship. And it has some interesting twists and turns, I think you'll see. This is Alan Grant. We live in a celebrity-obsessed culture, so we're going to get rid of maybe the biggest celebrity we're going to talk about today quickly here. This is Alan with his Coventry Motors Cobra, which you've already seen, in which he won his first race. And this car, Alan, are you ready to go here? This car has a paint job by someone fairly familiar to all of you.
Well, yes, as Michael has pointed out, I started my racing career in an AC Bristol, and growing up in Modesto, I had belonged to a little sports car club with a bunch of young guys. Most of us weren't even 21, and we were running autocrosses with false IDs. And when I turned 21, I raced the AC Bristol. Well, there was this little guy that was in the club. His name was George Lucas. And so George just kind of, latched on to me, and he became my buddy. And he went to every single race with me with the AC Bristol, where we won 12 out of 14 races. And then when I went to work for Shelby, and he let me know right up front that he didn't need any race car drivers after asking me had I ever driven. Well, that was a mistake, because I told him about every race I ever won. But long story short, I went to work as a, on a stock car. I'm on the ordering cars from AC and also for selling cars to dealers. Well, my biggest dealer was Coventry Motors in Walnut Creek, and all of a sudden Jay Brown, the owner, called up and says, "Hey, we want to buy a race car." And I said, I've only got one rebuilt factory race car, and I'll sell it to you under one condition. And he says, "What's that?" And I said, "I drive it." Got real quiet on the end of the phone, and finally he asked the same question: "Have you ever driven before?" Well, fortunately, Walnut Creek is in Northern California, and that's the SCCA region I raced in, and I told him that I'd won all these races. I said, "Furthermore," I said, "you got to put up an extra $500 because I want to blow off the factory team." And that really got him excited. And so he agreed to do that, and so I called George Lucas, and at the time I was living in Santa Monica. George got in his Corvair, comes down and slept on my couch. And of course, at the time, the factory race cars were dark blue or black, and they weren't really what I refer to as Penske-ized. I mean, they weren't just sharp as a tack and everything polished and et cetera, et cetera. And so George and I got our heads together, and I says, we need to get a car that will really show off in the field, when we blow off the factory team. And so we came up with yellow, not just any yellow, but DuPont tinting yellow. And then George wanted the car to stand out, and so he came up with a paint scheme where we came across the hood, with black stripes and back at a 45-degree angle. Dave Friedman in his books refer to this car as the prettiest racing Cobra of all. And so anyhow, that was my relationship, and that's how that car got to be, yellow. And this was our first race because, George was an integral part of it. I took him on the victory lap. But I kissed the queens twice. I mean, actually, there were two queens. I ended up getting to kiss them both. But I took George on the victory lap.
Alan, do you recognize who's in the background here? Haskell Wexler.
Oh, yes, Haskell Wexler. He was very big in Hollywood. And of course, George, literally when George came down to help me, he was literally flunking out of junior college. And his dad literally bought him into USC Film School. And it was through Haskell Wexler, which, by the way, Haskell Wexler came very close to buying the rear engine Scarab for me to drive in the Can-Am series. I'm not sure exactly what happened and why we didn't do it, but anyhow, George, formed a relationship with Haskell, and Haskell wrote a letter that was instrumental in getting him into the film school.
Wexler, by the way, won 2 Oscars for cinema photography, and he also directed some very interesting movies. One of his Oscars was for the thing where Liz Taylor and Liz Taylor and Burton scream at each other in the whole movie. He's a college professor. But in any case, we've got the celebrities out of the way, let's get back to racing or whatever. Now, when the program began, this is 1963, this is the first race, it's at Daytona, and whoever wants to chime in, go for it. Come on.
Well, that's Skip Hudson in the number 97 car, and I think, in fact, something happened and the clutch exploded and almost cut off his foot. When I came to work there, Skip was walking around in a cast.
Well, what's really interesting in this, we're on here? Okay. This particular car at Daytona in 1963 with Skip Hudson in the car was running pretty well, but in our early development of the Fords, we had the flywheels sheared the steering off this car, and it was crashed. And so they dragged it back to the shop and put it out behind the shop. And it actually became the chassis when we built the prototype Daytona. So that's where the Daytona originated, and we took the body off it because we couldn't get any drawings from AC. And so we reverse engineered the chassis, and that became the basis for the Daytona Coupe.
But at this race, it was established that Cobras were fast. Dan Gurney qualified fastest, but Davey McDonald finished fourth behind two Ferrari GTOs and a Vet. But it wasn't a bad start. However, the guys thought that maybe the whole thing was really just a test for the Indy Ford engine. And but they went ahead and persevered and did fine. The next was Sebring. Started off with a bang. This is the first lap. Phil Hill and the Cobra leading everything, all the prototypes, everything else. That was about as good as it got there, and things started to come undone, as might be expected in a 12-hour race, in only the team's second big international race. Comments?
Well, that's Phil Hill, and as I stated earlier, I was assigned to Phil Hill's car. Keep in mind, I'd worked for Shelby 2 months, and he had promised me, that if he needed drivers, he'd give me a chance. And to his credit, he listed me as an alternate driver at Sebring in '63. But I was assigned as a mechanic. I seem to have this dual purpose in my career. But Phil Hill, one afternoon, he says, Alan, he says, we need to come back tonight and adjust the headlights. He says, get all the tools you need to do that. So sure enough, we got out there after dark, and I had all my tools, and all of a sudden Phil Hill says, well, get in. I said, what? He says, man, I jumped in, and I could not believe that here I was, 22 years old, actually 21 at that time, 22. Anyhow, in a car with Phil Hill at speed at night, we'd go around a corner, and then he would stop, and we'd find a building, and he'd say, move the headlight out to the right, 12 feet. And so what he was doing was, with a Cobra, you don't go through a corner straight. I mean, you go through sliding. And so your car's like this, and your headlights you need to see what's over here. So what a thrill that was for me. Phil, well, we went on, and of course he was on the team in '65, and we became very good friends. And what a prince of a guy! Just a really an awesome guy. In fact, he's the one that really, when I was racing at Le Mans, he got me aside and he said, Alan, he says, I got to tell you, you've got to force yourself to relax. I mean, going down the Mulsanne Straight at 185 miles an hour, you want to hold on to, he says, you can't do that. You got to force yourself to relax. And so he was very, very helpful in my career.
This is Phil Remington. I think everybody will have a lot of comments about him. As this program is developing, between races, everything is being changed on these cars to make them work, to make them last not just 12 hours, but 24 hours for Le Mans. And Phil was an old hot rodder, impossible to work for, impossible to work with. Shelby used to bitch to me that the guys would just stand around and watch him work because his work was, I mean, he was a real Monet of sheet metal. And I'm sure these guys can tell you some Phil Remington stories.
I can say one thing about Shelby American and the whole Ford program, that Phil Remington was the person that made the whole thing operate. Without Phil Remington, we'd never have been successful. We just would have been another race team. But Phil was the guy that could not only engineer it, he could build it, he could fix it, he could see what was wrong, and he was a good leader of the team. And he was so good in the shop that you got to understand, we had the greatest collection of race mechanics you can imagine, and yet he'd see these guys working in the shop, and he'd just walk up and brush them aside, and half the time that they would do it, finish the job up. That's how good he was. He was just an amazingly capable guy, and I can't say enough how good he was.
Yeah, Phil was fantastic. We'd go out to Riverside Raceway, the 289 Cobras, and test them, and might be pushing, it might be oversteer, might be a number of things. Come back to the shop at the end of the day and talk to Phil, and he's telling what we thought it might be. He said, "I'll have it ready for you tomorrow morning." Next day we'd go back out there, and he fixed it. And he was phenomenal. He's the one that made all of our Cobras work. And had we not had Phil there, we probably would not have won near as many races as we did. And he's the one that got the GT40 working too. It was an English car, and they ran it at Le Mans, and it never finished. It was fast, but it never really finished. So they sent it over to Shelby, and Phil Remington is the one that got that car working. Ken Miles and I both drove that car, and Ken didn't like it, said it's terrible. I drove it. I had to agree, but you have to make it work. And so we changed a lot of things on that car, and the front end, the bodywork, everything got more aerodynamic. The suspension needed a lot of help, and the brakes, and we got that car working really, really well. But Phil is the one that made all of those cars Shelby had work, and work fantastic. And I ran the Daytona Coupe in '65, and Ferrari was quickest. I was second quick, and Shelby had all of the Cobras, everything, and we were going to blow off everyone. And Ferrari was quick. The prototype was quick. So the Ferrari got a little better start than I did. Then I catched him going in in turn one on the high banking, and drafted him, and then I just sort of eased out, went by like this, then I passed him, and then dropped down the embankment. By the time I got to turn two, I was doing 200 miles an hour, and had a lead of 18 cars. It was wild. That car worked so well. But again, that goes back to Phil. And also Richie Ginther was my co-driver, and he was great at setting cars up. Before that race, the front end would be pushing a little bit. Don't have the traction you need, so he just got some aluminum and cut the pieces. He gave dive planes on the front. Then when we got ready just before the race, we went out and practiced. I thought, wow, it's working fantastic. Now you're going to run flat out with it, where you couldn't before. And that was a great time.
So after '63 Sebring, Shelby was getting some light money from Ford, and there was no money to go to Le Mans. So he arranged a situation where Ed Hugas, who was a Pittsburgh dealer, in fact, the first dealer, they took AC cars where Shelby sourced the chassis and body. They entered one car, and then Hugus entered another. These were quite unique, and as you see, to make the hardtop work and the trunk
and was the single person most responsible for Shelby's success. Without Phil Remington, I doubt if there'd have been a Shelby American. I guarantee you there would not have been, USRC championships. There would not have been a world championship, FIA championship. Ford would not have won the races they won. Phil Remington was that important to this whole operation. And this guy, he's the one that hired me. And as Michael stated, his talents were incredible. Here's a guy with a junior college education, no formal education, but he was more than a fabricator. He was an engineer. The Ford GT Mark IIs, the brakes wouldn't last 12 hours. He engineered a way to be able to come in and actually change not only the pads, but change the rotors. And they could do that in 4 minutes. And without that technology, he's the one that designed the air jacks. I remember building those things. We come in for a pit stop, you plug in the air, and the whole car would raise. And to my knowledge, it was the first time it's ever been done. But anyhow, Phil Remington is a tremendous, tremendous guy. We lost him here a couple years ago, and it's just a real sad day.
But I think that it was really the collective. Shelby had a knack for putting together the best. I mean, the best drivers, best mechanics. And in the case of Phil, he was another California hot rodder. And, everybody thought, sure, with the Cobra, it was a fairly simple front engine, rear drive vehicle. But with the GT40, remember that Ford had originally given the program to John Wyer. And John Wyer, they never won a race or even finished a race. Am I right, Pete? Yep. And then finally, the last straw was the Bahamas Speed Week in '64. The Ford execs wanted Wyer to take a couple of GT40s, 103 and 104, which are being restored and will be in the museum here shortly, to the Speed Week because they all wanted to go down there and party. And of course, Wyer's both cars broke. And then finally Ford said, okay, that's it for you. These cars are going to Shelby American. They flew into LAX, these two cars. Bob went and picked them up, and you guys, you had 6 weeks from the time that you got those cars to the Daytona race. And here's the GT40, which is a very complex car. Even the Mark I's are extremely complex if you've looked at one in detail. And you got them going between Bob's input and Ken Miles and the rest of the team.
Oh, yeah.
And they won Daytona in 6 weeks' time, what John Wyer couldn't do in 18 months or so.
He was amazing. And then after Shelby stopped with the Cobras, he moved over with Dan Gurney in All-American Racers and they built a Formula One car. And so he just went to work on it, made it work. And it's a winner also. And they built an Indy 500 car. Some of those went well. Everyone started buying those for Indy 500 cars. And Phil is just amazing and fantastic person. Love him. He was just great.
But Michael, getting back to your slide here, what you're showing here is early Cobra Le Mans with the short trunk and the hard top, and this is really a lead-in to Pete Brock, because this was the attempt to become more aerodynamic. Shelby built 3 of these Cobra Le Mans team cars, 2 of which are in the museum. But Pete, how did this transition What was the real driver for the aerodynamics and the coupe?
Well, the thing is that it was very hard later when Carroll said that he wanted to go to Europe and race the car, and we had realized that the Cobra Roadster was not very fast, and I told him that I wanted to build a coupe, and he was very, very sort of reluctant to do it because he said, well, we already tried that in '63 at Le Mans, as you can see with this car with the fastback on it. And I said, well, it's not just the fact that we have a fastback on the car, it's the shape of the roof that is going to really change the whole idea. And I said the ideas that I've got, the inspiration for the Daytona, was actually designed in Germany in the late 1930s. In fact, the whole concept was patented or attempted to be patented in 1934 by Reinhard König von Fauschenfeld, a young aristocratic German who became very interested in aerodynamics because he was a motorcycle racer, and like most privateers, he realized that he couldn't win against the factories because the factories always have the hot stuff, but because he has a very inquisitive mind and racing motorcycles, he used his body really to study aerodynamics and came up with the idea for the chopped off tail and the very, very flat roof line. But nobody would really believe him until he won a couple of races. And then the war came, and all of that history basically disappeared. Nobody in the United States had ever seen it. I happened to discover his white paper when I was working at General Motors Styling for Bill Mitchell on the Stingray, and tried to show it to Bill on the Stingray program, and then Bill looked at it and says, "Kid, that's the ugliest looking shit I've ever seen. Now just get back and work on the car." So I basically put the idea away, and when the opportunity came, I explained to Carroll what I wanted to do. And as I say, he was a little reluctant, but as I explained it, he became more and more enthusiastic about it. And he said, "Do you really think that'll work?" And I said, "I think those Germans really knew what they were doing." And he said, "Well, okay, well, go ahead." And I said, "Well, what's the budget?" He said, "Well, we don't have a budget, but you can have that car that we just saw a little while ago that Skip Hudson had crashed. You can build your prototype on that." So that's what we did. And but I had to present the ideas of what we were going to do because the guys in the shop were going to build it. So I presented the drawings, the ideas to Phil Remington, of course, because I knew when Phil dived in and started to build it, it was going to be a huge success because anything that Phil built was work. Unfortunately, Phil had the same exact reaction that Bill Mitchell had. He looked at the drawings and said, "No, that's not going to work, you know." So we had this huge problem in trying to get anybody to convince it to do it. And if it hadn't have been for Ken Miles, Ken went to Carroll and said, "You know, I think Pete's got an idea, and you ought to at least let him go. It's not going to cost you anything. Right now, we've got a crash car we're building on. We'll go ahead and do it." So there was a problem within the company at that time between Phil Remington and Ken Miles. And there had been some enmity on that before because they hadn't agreed on an engineering principle. So the car was very controversial during that period of time. But we'll see some more photographs on it. Yep.
Also, in all fairness, you know, I would have not liked to have been Peter Brock during that period of time because, you know, Shelby had gone to, Ford had an aeronautics division, and he showed them the drawings, and they said it wasn't going to work. In the meantime, Remington wasn't behind it. You know, everybody in the shop was suspect, and Peter's credibility was on the line. I kid you not. And so tell them, Peter, when they first took it out to test, you know, what happened and what really turned the page on that deal.
You can see
I can basically tell you the story. They took it out, and that car, Miles was driving it, and he broke the lap record, you know, for Cobra's by, I don't know, 2 or 3 seconds. Plus, it got 25% better gas mileage. So after that, Peter's stock went soaring.
This is the wooden buck that we created to build the first aluminum panels for the Daytona. And standing right behind me there is John Olson, who came over from New Zealand. And John was actually the crew chief on the car. And the reason that he became the crew chief on the car is because he was kind of an outsider when he first came into the group. All the rest of our guys were pretty close California guys, and of course they followed Phil, and Phil Remington didn't want to have anything to do with the car. He thought it was a dumb idea. So he said to John Olson, why don't you go over there with Brock and work with Miles over in the corner and build that thing, and that we can get on with our real work. So it was really John Olson from New Zealand, myself and Ken Miles that really started to put that car together when it built this wooden buck up and took it down to Cal-metal shape and started building the panels. At that point, some of the other guys in the crew started looking at the car and came over and began to help on it on their own time. And it was just an amazing collection of people, because this was a car that was really designed by the collective experience of race car mechanics. This was not an engineered car. I'm not a graduate engineer. I'm not an aerodynamist or anything. I was inspired by what I'd seen the Germans had done, and it was very, very simple ideas, but being able to transfer those over and put them on the car, luckily it worked. We'll get the rest a little later. I was about 23, I think. I'd gone to work for GM when I was 19, and I think I was about 22, 23, yeah.
So Pete, did Ken Miles never raced the coupe, right?
What's that?
Did Ken ever run a race? He never ran a race with the coupe, did he?
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation with Ken. He never got to drive the coupe. Carroll was a very complex character, and when we got the car done and finished, because it was built like a suit around Ken Miles. I mean, he was the champion for the car within the company. We built it around his frame. He went out and tested it. I mean, the first time out of the box, we were 3.5 seconds a lap faster at Riverside, and we went down the chute at, over 180, 185, something like that, after it had only been run on 160. And I mean, he was really excited about the car and knew that he was going to drive the car at Daytona, and this was his chance to really shine. And Carroll took him out of the car and said, I'm going to make you team manager, and we're going to put Bob Holbert and Dave McDonald in the car. And Ken was absolutely so angry that he almost quit that day, but he knew it was the best team. He sucked it up and went back as a team manager and helped us win. But it was really Ken that championed the car.
So we continue. The first race for the coupe was at Daytona in '64, and there was a fire which ultimately resulted in its retirement. The next race was Sebring, and you can see here Sebring was a little bit of a flood that year.
No, that was that. That was
65.
Oh, this is '65. I'm
65,
sorry.
yeah. Right.
I just
It's a very, very famous race also we can talk
has
about.
happened
Yeah.
Something has happened to my guide here.
Let me fill in a little bit here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Bill. When we first took the car down to Daytona, of course, we'd had so little time to test it. I mean, the whole car was built from the first sketch to the time we ran it at Daytona in 90 days. You can imagine. So there was no development time on it. I mean, it was like right out of the box. And we took it out to Riverside the first time. As I said, Ken broke the lap record out there, 3.5 seconds. He only made maybe 10 or 12 laps. He didn't even have to run it any faster than that. He got out of the car, said, I've got to go call Shelby. You guys bring it back to the shop. We've got a lot of work to do. And when he got back to the shop, he told Carroll, he says, the car's working great, but we don't have enough traction at the back end. We need some bigger tires back there. And so Carroll, being the distributor for Goodyear tires, called Goodyear and said, can we have some new rear tires for the car? And because we're going to run at Daytona in a couple of weeks. And of course they said, we can't, have a new tire for you. He says, but we do have a new front tire for our stock cars that is almost the same dimensions you're talking about. It's a little wider section on it. And that might work for you. So they overnighted the tires out to us. We mounted them up on the cars, and they stuck out the rear fenders about 1.5 inches on either side. So there was no time to even change the body. They just riveted on some spats on the outside. I think you can see it in some of the new photographs we'll show here, to make the car legal, because there was a certain rule, the tire had to be covered by 120 degrees on the back. So the car went down to Daytona literally with hardly any time on it at all. And Bob Holbert was the first guy to get in the car, and he went out, and of course he was running against the Ferrari GTOs, which were the absolute best race cars that had ever been built in the world at that time. They'd been introduced in 1962 in Paris, had run for 2 years almost unopposed. Only Jaguar and Aston Martin were trying to get there, but they were the best cars in the world. And Holbert came in and said, this is so easy. He says, we've got to cut the RPM back on this. I can run away from these Ferraris with no problem at all. So Ken Miles said, okay, well, let's cut the RPM down 500 RPM. So Dave McDonald got in the car, and he went out and said the same thing. He says, I'm running away from these guys, so let's cut it down another 200 RPM. So at that point, the times on the cars going around Daytona were about the same. And at that point, we did a little checking on our fuel, because this is the first time we'd had a chance to do any real distance testing on it. And we determined that the car was about 25% more fuel efficient compared to the Roadster. So at that point, that determined what our race strategy was going to be. All we had to do was run the same speed as the Ferraris, and when they pitted, we could probably go another couple laps, and over the period of the 24 hours, we'd win the race. So the car was not only fast, it was very, very fuel efficient, and that's really what made it work so well. We got a new picture here.
Okay, how about Sebring in 64? Peter?
Yeah, that's 64 there. This is, you can tell the difference in the years because the first year is 1964. The cars were light blue, called Viking blue at that time. This is the paint job that we ran with Bob Bondurant and Dan Gurney in the number 5 car. And we first put 2 stripes down on, and so that was the beginning of putting the race stripes on the coupe.
By the time that the team had gotten to this point in the season, Ferrari had won 4 out of the 5 championship events. So even if the Cobra could win all the remaining races and Ferrari finished second, Ferrari would still win the championship. The Cobras won at Le Mans, but Ferrari was second, so they didn't make up that many points. So there were a couple hill climbs in between, and
this is wonderful. I haven't seen some of these photographs, and this is
so in between there were 2 of these hill climbs, which Bob Bondurant won both of. I mean, and that's saying something. I mean, a European hill climb is not simple. Bob, maybe you could comment on a hill climb versus a circuit race.
I started going over to Europe, and I bought a VW. Yep, a Bug. And I'd get up at 4 a.m. and drive it up and down the hill, and had the yellow columnar pad, and I'd draw all the different corners. And I said, this is going to be understeer on this corner, it's oversteer on the other one. And did that for 2 days. And so I learned the hill, the circuit. And then I go the next morning and go. This is the first hill climb we did in Germany. And Ferrari owned the hill climb championship for 7 years with the Ferrari GTOs. It was a fantastic car, just like Pete was saying. And you get practice, 2 practice days, and then you race. And because I had all that time in my, sounds crazy, in my VW learning the hill, but I just need to learn where it's all going to go. People lived up there on the hill. And so you start the first smaller cars first, and bigger bore cars last. So the small cars all went up the hill, because they did fine in their class. And then the Ferrari went up the hill, And then I went up the hill, and we did really well. We were quicker, and I thought, God, I couldn't believe it. And so the next day, it started raining at the top of the hill. And when you race in Europe, you learn to race in the wet. But I had never raced our Cobra in the wet yet. So, yeah, oh yeah, my wife said, there's no guardrails. Now they probably put them up, I don't know. But, and I didn't know where the rain was coming down the hill, but the Ferrari was ahead of me. So it would hit the rain later than I would. And then I went up the hill, and it started to rain, got sideways, collected it back the other way, backed off a little bit, and kept going. And at the top of the hill, we got to going pretty good again. And that was the end of the hill climb for that hill. And I won. I thought, wow.
One thing
Yay
that's,
for the bug. To learn how to,
one
the
thing
important
that's
thing
very
is to learn
interesting.
circuits. And when I went to Europe, Shelby made it possible for us to all go over there. And then Dan Gurney and I co-drove together. He'd raced there 4 times at Le Mans and had never finished. So Shelby said that, Dan, you should start, and Bondurant, you finish. And I said, that's no problem. And so it got to be the last time I finished the last run. And I had 4 Ferrari GTOs on my tail. And we were pulling them, and we were going down the Mulsanne Straight 197 miles an hour every single lap. So Pete's aerodynamics really worked. And just before the end of the race, one Ferrari got by. He lost his brakes, trying too hard. Oh well. And no one told me that before the race, if the last lap you get the checker flag, you slow down. But I had these Ferrari GTOs on my tail, and I didn't know it. The prototypes were ahead of us. They were 1, 2, 3, and by the time we got there, the spectators were coming over the wall onto the track, and I was doing about 120. I thought, oh, good Lord. So I braking, downshifting, and got the checker and went, oh, good. and it felt so good. The first time I ever been to Le Mans. And to win the first time with Dan, and then the Huska von Honstein was the head of Porsche Racing. He said, anytime you want to race Porsche, give me a call. I did later on. They said, we're trying to beat Ferrari all these years, and you just did it. That it felt fantastic.
So I'm gonna intercept here. So what he's talking about, for those who may not know, the number 5, the painting of the number 5 Daytona Coupe, is what Bob and Dan Gurney won Le Mans in. Now tomorrow in the Concours, Steve was kind enough to transport one of the Daytona Coupes here, and that car is incredible pedigree to it. It is the very car that Bob won Le Mans in, the first time anybody had ever beaten Ferrari in that class. So he and Dan Gurney did that in '64. So the car you're going to see tomorrow has the number 13 on it. But that's also the car that he was once number 5 and won Le Mans. The picture before that was number 15 in the deluge of water, where water was up to their waist in their cars. So that number 15 car that Bob and Joe Schlescher won Sebring in is also the number 13 car now, that I believe came in second at Daytona, with the GT40 Ken Miles number 73 in first place, the number 13 Daytona Coupe, which I swear was a woman because it loved Bob. And Bob drove the 3rd place GT40, so it was a Shelby 1, 2, 3 win that year. So when you see the number 13, the pedigree of that car is just unbelievable. So I wanted to just kind of, because they're skipping through the pictures pretty quick, I wanted you to know how important that car is. And thanks to Steve for bringing that, so you guys can see. He's still got his sweat and DNA in that car.
One thing about this picture that's kind of fascinating is notice that there's a chalk behind Bob's car, so it won't roll back down the hill while he's waiting for the start. This was the second hill climb that he won, and as you can see, they've spread oil dry all over there.
He won a total of 4 hill climbs.
But that vehicle, that FIA Roadster will be here. It just arrived. It'll be next to the Daytona Coupe, this car. And this is the 64 configuration. Like Pete mentioned, the cars in 64 were painted Viking blue, and then Carol went to the Guardsman blue, the more aggressive blue. So this car you'll see tomorrow has number 21 on it, which is from Bob's last win in 65 in Rossfeld, Germany.
Now, just to fill in the plot here, remember, we're racing for a championship, and after with 4 races to go, or excuse me, with 3 races to go, there's one going to be at Monza, which is a very fast track and would have favored the Cobras. There was one at the Tour de France that the Ferraris were a cinch to win, and then there was one scheduled for Bridgehampton and Long Island, which, because of being close to home base, the Cobras were favorite. Well, old man Ferrari had been fighting with the sports governing body about getting one of his cars approved as a GT car, which they had not done. And somehow or other he twisted their arm and they canceled the Monza race. So the second, penultimate, second last race was the Tour de France. And here you see the Cobra is leading the Ferrari. The GTO that is behind the Cobra was the Tour de France winner. And that race there allowed Ferrari to clinch the championship with 1 race to go.
How many hours were you guys in the lead?
The Tour de France, we were in the lead for a long time. And what you would do, again, we were the larger engine, so we started last, 3 of us. And right toward the end, well, you start the small cars first, and it's like doing a rally. And you come to the finish, and at that, we were in the lead. And Jochen Nerfosh, it was my co-driver there, a very good driver. And then we rallied to the next race, and the last one was going to be Le Mans. And I had raced at Le Mans, so I said, why don't you do that? And we were pulling into Rouen, France, and I could feel the throttle cable starting to pull out of the sheath it's in, and I thought, oh God, we're going to lose the throttle. And my mechanic looked at it, but he didn't see it. And so we're at Rouen, and we were running second at the time. Rouen's a lot of uphill, downhill, a beautiful racetrack in France. And at the very bottom, the cable pulled out. So I jumped out. I happened to have 1 French franc in my pocket, and lifted the hood, screwed the throttle, full throttle, got back in, and so I ran the rest of the race that way. So what would happen is I'd put it in second to take off, and then I'd time the shifting, but then when I come up to another corner, I'd have to shut the engine off and then turn it back on again to get it around the corner, so you're from 0 to full throttle. But we put it together. That's the crazy things we did, but it worked. Then after that, after the race, and had a huge crowd watching the race, my mechanic pulled the Suertara out, drove up on top of that, got underneath, got the throttle fixed. We were running behind, and then you have to get the next stop, and if you don't make it on time, you're disqualified. So in Europe at that time, the race drivers did not use seat belts. I did, and Mayor Fox was sitting next to me. And we took off. We had to get gas, so we pulled the first gas station we found. Let's get out, got two nozzles and put them in and fill the tank up. We did that, tossed it back to the Frenchman at the gas station. He went, "What the hell are they doing?" And we took off, and we had to change the rear tires because Le Mans was a faster track, so we wanted a taller tire so we'd go quicker. And I told the guys, "We don't have time to change the tire." And the guy that was changing the tire, they have a pullback deal to lift the rear up, and I took off. And so we're going down the highway and coming into the village.
Two-way traffic.
And two-way traffic, yeah. And I was honking on the horn and all that stuff. And then I going on the sidewalk sometimes, back down on the other side, and came to the.
I have to stop. David Piper is a very, very famous English driver who drove
he
the
was right with
green
me.
Ferrari. And we saw him in Europe about 3 years ago, and he said, "Pat," he said, "I still have flashbacks." He goes, "War heroes have flashbacks of bombs. I have flashbacks of fruit and tomatoes hitting my Ferrari." He said, "Because I followed your husband through the villages, and he was on the sidewalk, and pedestrians were jumping into the store. Fruit was flying." He goes, "It's coming in my window." He said, "All I did was just close my eyes and saw just enough bumper of Bondurant in front of me." He said, "I didn't care. I just held on for dear life."
He did.
He said, "It was the scariest day of my life." He said, "We got through it, didn't kill anybody. I had a lot of fruit. I actually started eating the fruit."
And we had beach track coming back from the beach, so the other way. So here comes a couple of cars. I have to just time lift, move it, stand on it, get by. And Mayor Fox said, I saw him starting to slip into a seatbelt. I thought, he's never done that before. He said, "Bob, please be careful. I have to put on a seatbelt." I said, "I'm going as quick and as careful as I possibly can, but we have to make the deadline to the next stop. If we don't, we're disqualified." And we got there, we had 16 seconds, or we would have been disqualified. Wild ride. I mean, we had all kinds of wild, crazy things we did in Europe with the cars and the Cobras.
That was the last
Right.
year they did the Tour de France.
Yeah, that was the last
so
year.
insane what they were willing to do was go from track to track, chasing each other through everyday traffic. I don't think we have a concept of how insane that was. Imagine being in the family car coming back from the beach, and there's this lunatic in the car, and a Ferrari chasing him, and I know they were accustomed to this race, but it had to have been extremely odd.
Some of those guys went off the side of the road, I'm sure.
Oh, you didn't, right?
No, I didn't. I made it.
This fruit stands.
And then after all of that, all three cars broke and Ferrari won
Yeah,
the Tour de France.
yeah.
That was a shame.
So
But it wasn't because he didn't try.
after the end of the 64 season,
Michael, can I interrupt just a second?
Certainly.
I think this is important. You referred to the fact that Enzo, through his political contacts in Italy, was able to get the Monza race canceled. Because had he not got it canceled, we had 4 Daytona Coupes finished, and if we'd have won, which I'm sure we would have, then, by getting it canceled, it made it mathematically impossible for the Cobras to win the championship in '64. And that's when Carroll Shelby came up with a famous phrase, "Next year, Ferrari's ass is mine."
well, you got to remember one thing, that the Machiavelli book was written by an Italian. So anyway, so over the winter, Alan has been in the service, comes back, and the first race is Daytona, and I wasn't there for this one, but as I understand it, one of the team members, John Timanis, who was a kind of a club driver in California, was absolutely terrified of the banks, and even the great Alan Grant was mildly scared. So here they are on the Daytona bankings.
I wasn't scared.
I knew that.
You know, I talked to everybody. I talked to Bob. I talked to, Gurney and Phil Hill. And, at Daytona, you go through the infield and you come in and come out of the infield onto the banked ovals. And turn 1, you come over to turn 2, then go down the back straightaway. And there's not a chicane like there is now. So we were going back into turn 3 at 185 miles an hour. And I kid you not, the first time I practiced, and I said, okay, I'm going to go into it wide open. As hard as I tried, I couldn't keep my foot down. It backed off. The bottom line is that you're going down there 180 miles an hour. It looks like a blank wall right there. You go into that turn, you don't turn the wheel. The horizon changes, and the G-forces shove you down in that car, and you go around the corner. So basically, it just took me a few laps to get up to speed. I was not scared.
In '64, we won a lot of races in Europe, and we were battling with the Ferraris. And the next year, we came back to Europe to race again. And I got off the plane, and an Englishman met me. He said, "Before you get your bags, you may want to listen to me."
Because Shelby had appointed him the team manager while he was over here. So Shelby had appointed Alan Mann, who ran the English team, to run the second year of the Cobra Daytona Coupes to win the World Championship again. But Shelby was, correct me if I'm wrong, was working so hard on trying to do that win at Le Mans overall that he actually did not make any of the races in '65 to watch these guys race. But Bob didn't have the support of Shelby. All he had was a contract in his briefcase that said he was the #1 driver. So when Bob's at the airport and the English team driver greets him and says, before you pick up your suitcases, you might want to hear me out. You're in England now, and in England, you're #3 driver. Alan Mann. Bob despises this guy so bad, even though the guy's passed away, he still refuses to say his name.
He said, "I'm Alan Mann, and I'm running a team this year, and I'm English." I said, "That's fine." And I have the two best English drivers in the world, and they're #1 and #2. And if you wish to stay, you would be #3, and you would never win. So you may want to go back to Cal Shelby. When he told me that, I thought, screw you. What I'm going to do, the fastest qualifier everywhere we went. And the first race we went to was Monza. It was a very fast track, and they still have the high bank walls. The very old walls made out of concrete. And I drove on that, and my vision started doing this. And I found at the end of one, they paid just enough for my vision came back. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to go flat out. And I did. And I was 5 seconds quicker than the Brits. And then Alan went out, the same thing. And he was 3 seconds quicker than the Brits. So we were a good team there. And so I was ordered to run behind the Brits, which did not feel good to me. And so we were quicker than the other people. So got a great start. And the second lap, they're leaning on the wall. Slow down, slow down. I go, oh God, this is ridiculous. So I slowed down a little bit. As soon as I'm out of sight, I'm flat on it. Then come around last turn, slow down. So then I made it ridiculous. I downshifted from 4th down to 3rd, cruised on by, and out of sight, standing on the gas. I did that for about 10 laps. Then I thought, this is ridiculous. Screw it, just go ahead and race. And in doing that, Alan and I lapped the Brits. And then at the end of the day, we were going to get together for dinner. We met in the bar, and oh God, who was it? Yeah, Jack Sears met me there, and he said, how come you didn't wait for us? I said, what did you say, Jack? He said, how come you didn't wait for us? I said, Jack, I don't know how you raced in England, but in the U.S., we race to win, and that's what I'm doing, and I will continue doing that. But I had to battle that all season long. And we ended up with the most points. And at the end, the last race was at Reims, France, 4th of July. And the one thing that Carol wanted is to beat Ferrari's ass. So I gave it to him. I won.
This is Jack Sears on the left.
Jack Sears is, I can't, he's that side. And since then, he and Bob have become very, very dear friends and like to laugh for many years now about those years. And unfortunately, Jack is not with us today because he is home in England and suffering from lung cancer. So we really,
that's a shame.
you know, where it used to be fun to poke this story, now Bob's heart's a little heavier because he knows he's probably going to lose his good buddy. But he's just such a great guy. If you've not met Jack Sears, he is just a delight. Would everybody agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I spoke with him on Thursday, and he sends his regards to everyone.
The other Brit on the right is Sir John Whitmore, who, these were the two guys that were supposed to be our two guys who are in the middle, Bob and Alan. So anyway, they go on from here.
Well, Michael,
Yes.
I have an important fact that I need to bring out. Sir John Whitmore was kind of the funny guy, the clown, and when the guys showed up, on his helmet, and we have a picture of this in the museum, I didn't bring it, was a chemical formula. You recall that? The
No, I
chemical,
don't.
yeah, on Whitmore's helmet. And everybody just didn't make much mention of it or much notice of it. And after a couple days, somebody asked, well, what is that chemical formula written on your helmet? And Whitmore said, well, that's chicken shit. Since Carol Shelby was a chicken farmer.
I have another funny formula on the helmet story. You guys are going to get a kick out of this. There's a very famous picture of Bob Bondurant, who had, and still does, Hollywood good looks, great cars, in Europe, in an American car that was so loud it was deafening when they went by in these villages. And so they would have those, remember the punch guns that you could punch alphabetical numbers and like they were sticky on the back and they were label makers? Well, they used to put those on the back of their helmets, and they wanted to know what blood type you were and if you were male or female. And so some they had their blood type and others were whether you were male or female. I have no idea why they were doing that on the back of these guys' helmets. It's like it might be obvious if you were a girl or a boy, but most of the guys they would put, and the word they wrote back then was sex. So you're either an M or an F. And Bob put yes. So these helmets with these labels, this story goes way back. And then another thing about tagging that Ferrari's ass is mine, it was Bob's Cobra that he took out on a test track, and I'm not sure where, that the mechanics wrote Ferrari's ass is mine on the back of the trunk of his Ferrari. So yeah, it was the Nürburgring. So I'd love to find that picture so you guys could see that that was kind of how comedic these guys were in a very serious situation.
So
The
even
very
though
last race was in Sicily, and I was supposed to let Jack win because he hadn't won. I said, okay. And when the inspectors inspected our Cobras, they thought my car was Jack's, and so they passed that car. Then they found out it was my car, so they said found something that is wrong, but it wasn't wrong, and so I didn't get to qualify. But I had raced there 2 weeks earlier in a Formula 2 car, so I learned the circuit well. And so anyway, we started the race. I was quickest qualifier. Let Jack go by, and I put a pair of goggles in my door. When we raced the coupe, we never used the goggles. And we're going along, and Jack starts dropping wheels off, and that was chipping off paint in the car. Then he did that for about, 6 or 7 laps, maybe 8 laps. And then he picked up a boulder, and I cracked my windshield, and I said, okay, I'm done with that. So I slowed down, put my goggles on, and took off and passed him. And they have a very fast high-speed left turn, right turn. And I caught the green Ferrari, David Piper, and I passed both of them through that. The coupe was a very fast car, and then they had a Ferrari that was supposed to be much faster, and so we were racing for a while. Then he disappeared, and I saw a whole group of people down at the end of this very fast corner in some red, so he must have gone off there. So he was out. Then we went to get a fuel stop. And normally what we did, we always had a quick fill tanks, and I filled both of our cars up. And the Sicilians didn't like me because I was an American, and I was racing really hard against Ferrari and doing a pretty good job of that. So they pulled me back in, made my mechanic drain the fuel tank, and then put it in with a regular fuel nozzle, just like you have at a gas station. So it took much longer.
But he still won.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that was wild. And I didn't care because I knew that was the last time we were going to run the coupes. So I said, screw it, let's just do it. Then winning the World Manufacturers Championship on the 4th of July was so incredible. And that just felt so good. Unfortunately, Jack Sears blew their motor, but the mechanics figured how to fix it so he could still run on 7 cylinders. So
Okay.
that's it.
Thank you. Here, this is the winning car at REM on July 4th. There was one more race after the Cobras won the championship. It was at Enna in Italy. This is a picture of the 2 cars. The Brit is leading Bob. Bob was supposed to lay back. Those were team orders, but he ran right behind. Was that Sears? Yeah, I guess it was Sears, and so Sears got kind of upset because Bob was really disobeying team orders by pressing him, and so he would run over the apron of the track so he could throw back big hunks of dirt onto Bob's car. Now, normally a driver in that situation, I believe, would have dropped back about 200 yards and solved the problem, but Bob thought the best way to do it was to when the windshield got cracked, he decided he would, he had a pair of goggles for just, in case this would happen. So he just put on his goggles and passed Sears. And there were 2 Ferrari prototypes leading the race, and Bob caught them. But then they started giving him pit signals that he was 1 lap ahead, when in fact he was leading, and Bob dropped back, only to find out after the race that he had been leading. So that was the last of the Cobra Coupe races, and the cars came home and were around Shelby's shop, some of them for quite some time. There was one last run at Bonneville. Go ahead.
One thing I'd like to add here is that the value of these cars to Shelby was really nothing at this time. He'd already gotten a contract to Ford Motor Company to run the GT40. So the offices at Shelby's were overrun with what they call the Fairlaners, all the guys from Ford that had taken over the Shelby operation. So when the cars were all finished over in Europe at Alan Mann's, they were returned to his shop there and sat there for a few weeks, you know, gathering dust. And one day there's a knock on the door, and it's the federal tax man, and he says, you're going to have to pay a tax on these cars because they've been brought in under bond. And if taxes are not paid, we're going to have to destroy the cars. So there's a panic, you know, at Mann, so they telex Shelby American and say, we have to have the money to pay this tax or the cars are going to be destroyed. Silence, because nobody at Ford or Shelby cares about these cars at all. So more telexes go back, no answer at all. Finally, the tax guy comes in and says, okay, we're going to pick the cars up in a couple of days, and they're going to be put on a barge, and they're going to take them out and dump them in the North Sea. And the price for that is going to be X amount of dollars. So they telex over to Shelby and find out it's actually cheaper to fly the cars home than to dump them in the North Sea. And that's the only reason that the cars were saved. And they were returned to Shelby American because they were absolutely valueless to Shelby at that point.
And what's the last auction price?
Well, they've changed hands privately. I think the last one went to Argentina, double the price. I think it was $8 million, but by the time they got it in, it was close to 16. And I think Maruyama was offered almost 20 million at the last Concours at Monterey.
One other thing.
And
So
that's
the
cheap.
cars-
Look at what Ferraris are going for,
Yeah.
twice that.
So 65, we were racing 1-year-old cars, not a new one. They still ran good, and the mechanics did a great job making those cars run. And the 24 car that I ran that you just saw on the screen, that was the one that it got windshield was cracked and all that. And then I came back. Pete and I got together and we got.
How much you paid for it?
That's what I get at. Yeah. So how much did I pay for it? We had I drove it on the street for a little while, and then you have to have your work done. And Pete and I were standing at L.A. airport where Shelby was and deciding what we were going to do with it. And Shelby called me and he said, Ford said I have to sell all the cars. And you drove that car more than anyone else. And so I want you to buy it. And I said, well, how much? He said, $4,000. And I thought, in those days, I didn't have a lot of money. You know, I got $4,000. So I bought it, and then sold it for $10,000. Thought I made a killing, but I used that money to start my school. It's funny how everything happens. But all of us that raced the Cobras had a great time doing so, and I was so glad that Shelby took us to Europe. I always wanted to race against the world's best, and that's where they were. And so it's been great. Thank you.
So the nice thing was that the cars are still raced, even though they're worth $8 million. This is Rob Walton of Walmart racing his at Laguna Seca Historics, leading a Corvette as they always did. So that's kind of the end of our story. We want you guys to ask us some questions. And we'll have just a cute little thing of Carroll Shelby as an angel here. And he was no angel, but anyway, that's the end of today's program. You are now the program out here in the audience.
That'll be interesting.
Lights. I don't know who's out there. Is there somewhere who knows how to light the hall? And is there a remote mic for the audience? Okay, whatever questions you have, go ahead and I will repeat them over the PA.
Yes, Louise.
Can you talk about it a little bit more? All you showed was the slide at Bonneville. No, I can't let you get away with just that.
All right, what the Bonneville slide?
Tell the folks a little bit about why that car was there.
Very interesting. There was a great marketing contest. We need the Bonneville slide on the last slide up there. As
Can't do it.
many of you may remember, there was a great marketing battle going on between Firestone and Goodyear at that time on the land speed record. And both Craig Breedlove was up there to break the record on it, but the car wasn't running, and the rules were that if you weren't running on the salt, you had to relinquish the car, relinquish the salt to anybody else that wanted to run it. And of course, the Firestone car at that time could have gone out and broken the record, and this was an extremely important thing between Firestone and Goodyear. So they called back to Akron and asked them to call Shelby and send a car up there and pretend to set records on the salt so that the Firestone opposition couldn't get on the salt. So that's the only reason that the car was taken up there. As you can see, the picture on it had number 10 on it, which was the last race that it ran at Le Mans. It had the number 10 on the car, on the side of the car. It had been on tour, on the power tour with Shelby. So Tom Greaterix, who was our crew chief for one of our private teams, loaded it on the trailer, drove it overnight, all the way up to Bonneville. They arrived there and, quote, see the number 10 on the side of the car there. Breedlove looked at the car and said, well, that's that funny looking thing on the back of the car. That's going to slow that thing down. We better take that thing off of there. That was the rear spoiler. So, and Tom took the rear spoiler off because these experts at Bonneville had told them it wasn't going to work. So they got out there at about 135 and they couldn't keep the car stable and it spun out. So they finally came back and put the spoiler back on, and amazingly the car was transformed and it was a record breaker again. So they went out and they set 23 international records out there during that weekend, and they could have gone at 24 hours. They went to the USAC people who were responsible for the timing, and they said, we want to run on the 12-mile circle for 24 hours. And they said, well, we can't do it. We're not set up. We don't have the lights on it, but you can run for 12 hours. And yeah, so as you may know, the salt has been depleted over the years. So in the 12-mile circle, over one section of it, it had to run off kind of in the dirt. It's gotten so thin that they ran it in the 12 hours, and they had to stop and refuel the car. They didn't even have dump cans to put it in. They had to put the fuel in through a little hose, and they still ran it and set a great record on it. But the car was so thrashed from running out on the dirt on that one section there, and the salt had broken up so bad that the windows were broken, the lights were falling out of it, and everything. And of course, the last time Carol had seen it before it had gone to Bonneville, it was this, perfectly pristine car from Le Mans, which had blown its engine, so it hadn't gone very far. And so it got back there, and he walks down and looks at the car, and obviously he's absolutely appalled because it looked just like it sits there with salt rime all over it. It's all bad condition. He looks at all the guys in the shop and said, anybody want to buy this? Silence. He said, anybody want to buy it? $800. Silence, including me. So we all turned it down. So he called Craig and offered it to Breedlove. And Breedlove says, well, I don't know what I'd do with it. And Carol says, well, how about 500? And he said, nah, I'm going to pass. So the car, nobody bought it. We brought it back, fixed it back up, and sold it to Russ Kit as a slot car promotion. And that's the way it ran on the street for a couple of years until he sold it to put his kids through college. And then it went on to John O'Hara, the roadie for Phil Spector. So the car's had quite a strange history, but every one of those cars has a great story behind it. And
Well, I think that you're understating the story of O'Hare. I mean, O'Hare's wife, ex-wife, had the car stored in her garage. She self-immolated in a park with 2 of her pet bunnies. So there were some characters involved. Special cars attract special people. And just depends which side of the special deal you're on. So the car has one hell of a history.
I think this is a great picture for everybody to appreciate. If you think it's hot and humid here, these guys raced in the summertime in Europe with very similar conditions that we have here in Kansas City, and that little window on that side is exactly the size of the window, and that's all the air they got with the heat of those engines coming up to that floorboard. And then Bob was sharing that he and Jochen Neerposch took a piece of wood and propped the door open while they're racing through the Tour de France because they were so hot they thought they were going to pass out. But look at the size of that window, and that was it. That was all the airflow those guys got. Boy.
I've
Questions?
got a
We
file
lost weight doing
on this
that.
car, an inch thick. I was at John O'Hara's house. The car was sitting out in the side of his garage, and I negotiated a deal with him. You know, I thought he owned it, but it was actually his wife that actually owned it. And then once they got divorced, I hired a private detective to go down and try to find that car. And I personally spent a lot of time. So, in fact, Dr. Simone, I met him I'm going to give him my file because I've got, that's an incredible car.
Peter, I'll add at the end. I talked to Craig a couple of weeks ago. He told me that story. He said, worst business decision I ever made.
Right.
I think it was the worst decision that any of us in the shop ever made. If we'd known what these cars are worth now, we probably all would have snapped them up. And you know, even Bob sold his car off the start of school, you know, for a few $1,000s, and later he thought he'd really cut a fat hog, doubled his money on it, but it's worth millions now.
Not as able to start the school.
That's right.
We've been in business now 48 years, and it still runs fantastic. And my wife is president, and a really good president. She works her tail off every day.
And I change his hearing aid batteries every day. That's why I'm up here. Well, you guys, when these guys are up here, they can't hear the speakers that way, so they can't hear the questions very well. So that's my role up here today.
Oh, Pat, it's because of your good looks.
No, it's because I know a little bit about his history. When you're in love, you want to know everything about your man. Yeah.
Questions?
Bob, talk about the final race that you and Dan shared to win the World Championship together.
The question is, would you like to talk about the final race that you and Joe Slusher won the World Championship?
Oh, yeah. The final race was held on the 4th of July, and I was driving in the 26 car, and that car was a fantastic. Was that the one of the cars that were built in Italy?
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah.
2601.
Yeah, that car, we won many races with that car. And Joe Slusher and I were going to co-drive it, and we did.
You'd already won Sebring with Joe.
Yeah, Joe and I had won Sebring together, and we just worked well together. And we're still driving for Alan Mann. And then Joe went, I said, if you go out and go too fast, they're going to pull you in. And I said, I don't care. I don't like to drive slow, but to let those guys win, I want to win. So do I. But it happened. So we went out and blew him off. He got black flag, came in. The young man said, get out of that car, and we're going to put someone else in it if you don't slow down. So he said, okay, and then I went out.
But that's That's the part where his wife was so angry that Alan Mann told Slessor to either slow down or he's going to get him out of the car. That's the famous scene, ladies, where the wife
yeah.
throws the glass of champagne in Alan Mann's face. Such a moment.
That, by the way, in the picture is Annie Schlesser and her husband Joe.
Yeah.
And as we showed you earlier, Tom.
Sasha was a
As we
really great
show-
guy. He wanted to drive Formula One. He drove a Honda, and unfortunately he crashed and died.
But how was the wind? The wind across the track, the way Alan Mann made you and the other car that you were 9 laps ahead of. You had to do a photo finish.
Oh,
with
yeah.
the number 27 coupe. I think that's the question he's
Well,
wanting to know.
What Pat's talking about is that the Sir John Whitmore and Jack Sears at Reims, basically they lost a cylinder, and so they brought it into the pits, and they took the spark plug out, and they were able to run on 7 cylinders, but they were several laps behind, and then it was
9
Alan
laps
Mann
behind.
decided, 7 laps behind Bob and Joe. And then Alan Mann wanted to have a photo finish, and I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
the question out there, because I think I know that guy, because he loves this part, where the Americans won in the champagne capital of the world on the 4th of July, an American car, and it was all great.
It was fantastic. I really loved racing the Shelby and all those team drivers. It was one of the best things in my life. And then I ended up racing Formula One. And then when we won the world, I got a call from from Enzo Ferrari's office, and they wanted me to come down and met him. Meeting Enzo Ferrari is like, wow. I mean, he's the king of racing. In Europe, it's huge. And I got along fine with him. And he said, are you coming back to Italy next year? I said, I don't know yet. I wasn't planning on it. I could. He said, what would make you come back? I said, I'd like to drive Formula One for you. Oh, but you must drive he called it the prototypo, the prototype. And so I'm doing that with Carroll Shelby and the Ford GT40. So I have that experience. And he took me on a walking tour through the shop. I mean, see all these beautiful Formula One Ferraris and the prototypes. I mean, my God, that'd be fantastic. And so we got done, and I said, when will you let me know? He said, when I decide. I said, 1 week, 2 weeks? He looked at me very seriously. He said, when I decide. So I thought, I better shut my mouth. And that weekend was the Italian Grand Prix, and I was racing Formula 3. And before each Formula 1 race, they do a Formula 3 race. It turned out an English car had a Sarah, and said, do you want to drive it? I said, sure. And we ended up winning. So all of that turned out great. And I raced for Ferrari and Formula One and the prototypes. So my life is, as my wife calls it, in 2 places. What do you call it?
He's lived his life in 2 halves. The first half was being a world champion driver, and the second half, training other people to be champions. That's how Bob Bondurant has lived his life.
Yeah, I had one really bad problem. I was racing Can-Am cars at Watkins Glen, New York, and going through a corner at 150, the right steering arm broke. That took me off the track. I felt something break, the back end started to come out. And so the right steering arm broke, the wheel just turned right. And I shut the fuel pumps off. In those days, the cars weren't that safe, and I didn't want to catch on fire. So I shut the pump off. And then when I was racing Formula One, a bunch of us got together one day. I do teach this at my school. Said, Let's say you're going into a 150 mile an hour corner, and you have to brake. You go to the brake pedal, and it goes to the floor. So you're hanging on for dear life. You're downshifting, and you're going to hit. So you're hanging on, and you just take a deep breath. Just relaxes your neck muscles, shoulder muscles, arms and wrist, and relax your upper body. And just milliseconds before I hit, I did that. I thought of it real quick. And I hit head on the embankment, went straight up above the treetops, and came back down and flipped 8 times, end over end and sideways. And then I was listed as dead. And you can take care of the rest.
Well, the way he tells me the story is that when he went into the hospital, the doctor said that, you know, it was the worst accident he had ever seen at Watkins Glen, and told Bob all of his injuries, concussions and broken ribs. And then he paused and said, you know, you'll never walk again. And Bob said, why? And he goes, all the bones in your feet and ankle have been crushed.
That's my car.
And so that photographer said that was the lap before the steering arm broke. And so as a result of that, Bob asked the nurse for a coloner pad, and he wrote down how to do a school, because he said it gave him a lot of pleasure to train all the actors in the movie Grand Prix, James Garner and Yves Montand and all those guys. So we still have that pad with him drawing a little stick man at a steering wheel and all the parts he would need and everything. Yeah. And that happened in June of 1967. And in a cast, he still opened that school on February 14th, 1968. And his third and fourth students were Paul Newman and Robert Wagner, and he had to train those guys for the movie Winning. So, I mean, this guy's colorful career and past and story, it just goes on and on. There's a picture I saw when I first met Bob, and it's this car in the air, and there's no asphalt underneath it. And I go, oh my gosh, what happened here? He goes, oh, I won the first Baja 500. I go, what did you not drive? And he just got inducted in the NASCAR Hall of Fame because he used to race against Dale Earnhardt, Richard Petty, and Bobby Allison, and all those guys. And he's being inducted in the Corvette Hall of Fame this September. That'll be the 8th Hall of Fame he's been inducted in, for winning 30 out of 32 races in those Corvettes before Shelby finally put him in the Cobra. So the school is an amazing place, and if you haven't been, you're most welcome, and if you have been, you're welcome back. I'd like to see you again. So.
Yeah, I said, why do you wait till I'm 83? But I'm glad I got in.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I'm associated with the Lake Garnett Grand Prix Revival, which is a tribute to the Lake Garnett Grand Prix, which ran from 1959 to 1972. And I know the Shelby team ran there quite successfully. Wondering if any of you panel members had raced there or knew anything about it, had any experiences.
Well, let me start and then they'll finish. But the interesting thing was they came and they ran in the production car class. And then they said they won that. And then they said they wanted to run in the modified car class, the fastest cars. They said, no, you can't do that because it's only for modified cars and you've got a production car. So if I'm telling the story correctly, and I will certainly be corrected if I'm not, they took the oil cooler off the car, they went back to tech and said, okay, we modified it. So they let them run, and they won that as well.
So, Michael, didn't Graham Shaw run there?
I think it was Ken, but I could be wrong.
No, it was Ken Miles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I thought. Go ahead.
In 1985, I believe we had a couple races in downtown Kansas City. You guys were involved in this. There was a 427 King.
That's
Super Coupe.
yeah. That was
Yeah, that was a super coupe.
Here,
Yeah.
Steve, let's see. Steve's got a great story.
Bob rode that car,
No, you're right. I'll tell you that story because it's a very interesting story. I lived here in Kansas City at the time. I went to Bondurant school, and that was actually my first race. But this is not about me. But Bob Sutherland had the Super Coupe, and Pete could tell you a lot about the Super Coupe, but essentially it was never finished. But the Super Coupe is a 427 version of the Daytona Coupe. It looks quite different. Anyway, Bob Sutherland had the pieces of it. It was put back together very quickly, and the idea was to race it in the Kansas City Grand Prix. But I think you're referring to Dick Smith. Dick Smith was a real famous SCCA driver in a 427 Cobra Roadster, a 427 Cobra Roadster, and his claim to fame was that when he ran at Daytona, they clocked him at 198 miles an hour, so he always had 198 was always his number. And so Bob was kind of walking into this blind. Bob was going to drive the Super Coupe, or did drive the Super Coupe, which was just in horrible shape mechanically, and wasn't sorted at all. It was a very ill-handling car at that time. Dick Smith showed up in his 427 that he was run all over the country and knew that car very well. And it was quite an epic battle, if you recall. The red Cobra 427 and Bob in the Super Coupe, and of course Bob prevailed and beat Dick, which was a big surprise, I think, to everybody.
Me too.
Is that the race you're talking about? Yeah.
I want to know what you
That's all you need.
Okay. I was driving a 275 GTB Ferrari and didn't do very well. That was my first race. And I was running against Bob Donner in his Ferrari GTO, for those of you that remember him.
Yep.
But Bob Bondurant put on quite a show. That was really quite a show that day. That's right. And boy, that Pete, no reflection on your genius, but that car was so unprepared, and Pete wasn't involved in the completion of that, right? But
It's a horror story.
it's a horror story, is what Pete just said. But nonetheless, Bob was able to drive it.
So if you were there, the second heat, Bob was tossed a Ferrari by somebody that he had never driven the Ferrari before, and he won that one too that day. So it was a
We have
big
a
day. Bob
question.
loves Kansas City.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, I want to thank you guys so much for coming to Kansas City and doing this. As a lifelong Shelby aficionado, hearing some of these stories that aren't in any of the history books has been really special. So I want to say thanks to all of you guys for participating. One of the things that I've never heard is, what was the reaction in '64 at Shelby American when you guys got the news that Enzo had the Monza race canceled? And did Shelby try to do anything to contest that?
Did Shelby contest when Enzo pulled out of the Monza race? Did Shelby throw a fit? Because I can't imagine him not throwing a fit.
I don't remember that he threw a fit. He was very disappointed because Enzo had a very strong, what you call it?
No
Influence.
Contest the situation.
I will
Yeah.
say this.
I was in the hotel room in London with Carol at the time that he got the phone call that the race in Italy had been canceled. And it had only been technically canceled. They didn't tell the public. There was nothing in the papers that went on with this. Ferrari had gone to the Auto Club to Monza, the Auto Club d'Italia, and had been crying that he had not been able to get his 250 LM homologated, and he was being unfairly criticized for not building enough homologated cars. So he convinced the Auto Club d'Italia to rescind the FIA points for that race. The race still went on. Obviously, Ferrari didn't show up, Aston Martin didn't show up, we didn't show up, Ford didn't show up. So it was just a free-for-all for Ferrari. He brought his 250 LMs and entertained the crowd, and And since there were no points awarded, he automatically won the championship. There was nothing that Carroll could have done about it. He might have contested, gone to the FIA and complained, and maybe 5 years later of litigation, they would have determined something and he would have lost. But Ferrari just outsmarted him politically, that was all.
But the reason that that race was pulled was because the Americans were only 5 points away from winning the championship that year.
Right.
So that was why.
We'd fought that whole year with two coupes, with Bob winning at Le Mans, which is our big win. And if we had not lost the first race at Daytona with the fire, we would have had enough points to have won the championship.
Yeah.
And that was a bad tactical move that we did not end up running the race all the way through at Daytona after the fire at Daytona. But there was nothing you could do about it.
I would like to invite all of you to go to the Bondurant.com site. Bob and I chaired a child abuse charity, and twice it was called Drive the Dream, so we did it around racing, obviously. So the first time I was allowed 9 minutes to do a video on the Le Mans win, and then the second time they asked us to be chairs, we invited Pete to be there, and Alan, weren't you there? Yeah. They gave me 12 minutes to do the documentary on the entire 65 championship year. So if you go to Bondurant.com and then you go to click on the videos, you'll get to see some really detailed information about both of those wins in those years. But Michael Schoen was the guy that wrote the Cobra Ferrari Wars, and in big part with Bob helping him with that book. But he is one of the guys I interviewed in that film, and it's really informative, and it'll actually make the hair raise on your arm when you see how the underdog, the Americans, just did it, and it's such a proud moment. And I'd like to just circle this around from last night when we met Darren, who brought his son. Bring your kids to these events. Bring your kids to these concursos. We're just losing the magnificence of what this did and the empowerment of watching the Americans go to Europe as the underdogs and win the world championship. It's such a moment, and we're just not bringing our kids and grandkids the way that we should be, and that's how we're going to pass this heritage and legacy along. And to somebody's point last night, if we don't teach them about these cars, who's going to buy those cars from us?
There was someone in the back that had a question.
Is this turned on? I'm reading the book Drive Like Hell.
Can you put the mic as close as you can to your mouth?
Okay, I'm reading the book Drive Like Hell, and I'm interested in the aspect of dealing with the Ford executives, particularly the Deuce and a gentleman by the name of BB. Did any of you ever have any experience with them?
What was your interaction with, and Edsel's dad?
Oh.
What was that like? Oh, I remember them telling you had to slow down.
Oh, yeah.
The Ford team did.
Yeah. The Ford team that you know by Daytona?
No, we're talking about Edsel Ford's dad, Henry Ford. They
Oh.
called him the Deuce, remember?
Oh, that's
And
right.
so
Could you
what do
repeat that question
remember-
again?
What do you remember about the Deuce, and what influence did he have on you guys during that era?
Well, he wanted me to slow down and
To save the car.
to save the car, and the car was really good, but they had a gearbox in it that wasn't strong. But Ken Miles and I learned how to drive the car and shift the gearbox smooth, and it worked perfect.
Talk to the microphone.
So,
But he told Carol to slow you down.
yeah, I told Carol to slow me down. That was at Daytona. And the gearbox we had in the car at that time was not a good gearbox. But the late Ken Miles and I learned to shift that nice and smooth, take care of the car, and it ran perfect. And the guys that told them to tell me to slow down were the Ford guys.
Henry Ford. Shelby
Yeah.
came out with the hammer.
Oh, yeah, that was,
Shelby told me this story.
you tell it. You can do better than I can.
Well, Shelby, the way Shelby told me, and Bob absolutely confirmed it was at Daytona, and they were just, Bob was in the lead in the number 72 Ford GT40, and then he had a condenser part that he lost 11 laps, and so he was trying to catch up because he knew he could win this race. So imagine being 11 laps behind, and you are just got your foot in the throttle, and Shelby said that the Deuce told him, get out there and get that lanky guy to slow down and save that car. I need it to cross the finish line. I don't need him to prove something. And so Shelby went out with a hammer on the sidelines to get Bob to black flag him to bring him in. So Shelby said, I had Bondurant pulled in, and I'm screaming and everything, and I'm making this big dramatic scene in front of the Ford cheese. And he said, I was never so happy as when Bondurant argued with me and said, Shelby, get out of my way, I'm wasting more time. And Bondurant just drove off, and he said, I was so proud of that moment of me just watching my man go out there and do what I need him to do, but I had Ford in my ear telling me to do something different. He goes, I was so proud of that moment when he just took off. So, but he did say he was swinging a hammer at him, and that just thrilled Ford.
Have a knockoff hammer. They're bigger than a regular hammer.
Yeah, big rubber hammer, so.
Well, I want to thank all of our guests today, and thank you all very much. This room is reused again this evening, so we have to end this so everyone gets some rest,
Okay.
and we can prepare for the reception this evening. So thank you very much. Wonderful
One minor
afternoon.
point here. A few people had asked me to bring some books down on the Corvette, so if anybody's interested, we have a few copies down here.
This is a way cool book, so you should take a look, let me tell you.
Right. Thank you all very much.